I walked into my own home office to grab the guest list and found my husband of 28 years with his hands on my son's fiancée's face, their lips inches apart, her engagement ring catching the afternoon light as she gripped his shirt. They froze when they heard me gasp. And in that suspended moment, I saw my entire family's future collapse into something unrecognizable. My husband started to speak, but I held up one hand, smiled with a calm I absolutely did not feel, and said 5 words that would change everything. I told them to carry on. Then I turned around, walked out of that room, and began planning the most strategic dismantling of a marriage, and a lie that anyone in our family had ever witnessed. What happened after that moment of apparent acceptance shocked everyone who thought they knew me, including the 2 people who had just destroyed everything I believed about my family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Catherine Monroe, and before that Thursday afternoon in October, I believed that I had built something rare and valuable over nearly 3 decades of marriage. I believed that my husband Robert and I had created a family characterized by loyalty, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. I believed that my son Daniel had found a partner worthy of joining our family, a young woman named Sophia who seemed to share our values about commitment and integrity. Every single one of those beliefs was about to be revealed as either naive misperception or deliberate self-deception, and the discovery would force me to examine not just my marriage but my entire understanding of who I was and what I was willing to accept. The party I mentioned was supposed to be Daniel and Sophia's engagement celebration, an event I had been planning for 6 weeks with the kind of attention to detail that had characterized my approach to every significant family milestone throughout my adult life. We were expecting 40 guests that Saturday evening, a carefully curated mix of family members, close friends, and professional colleagues who had known Daniel since childhood. I had hired caterers, arranged for a string quartet, ordered flowers that matched Sophia's preferences, and prepared our home to showcase the kind of elegant celebration that would mark this important transition in our son's life. Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the party, I was in the kitchen reviewing final details with the catering coordinator when I remembered that the guest list was in my home office. I had been using that space to organize party planning materials, keeping everything consolidated, so I could manage the various vendors and arrangements efficiently. The office was at the back of our house, a converted sunroom that overlooked the garden Robert and I had cultivated together over 20 years. It was my private sanctuary, the one space in our home that was entirely mine, decorated according to my preferences and used primarily for my freelance consulting work and personal projects. I walked down the hallway toward the office with my mind entirely focused on catering numbers and table arrangements. I was thinking about whether we had ordered sufficient appetizers, and whether the bartender would arrive early enough to set up before guests started arriving. These mundane logistical concerns filled my consciousness completely, leaving no room for suspicion or vigilance about what I might encounter when I opened my office door. The door was not fully closed, just pulled mostly shut in a way that might have seemed casual to anyone not paying close attention. I pushed it open while already turning toward the desk where I had left the guest list that morning, my movement automatic and unsuspecting. The scene that materialized in my peripheral vision took several seconds to fully register, my brain initially refusing to process what my eyes were clearly seeing because the reality was so fundamentally incompatible with everything I believed about my family and my life. Robert was standing near the window with Sophia positioned directly in front of him. His hands were cupping her face in a gesture of unmistakable intimacy and intention. Her hands were gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him closer rather than pushing him away. Their faces were so close that I could see the gap between their lips measured in millimeters rather than inches. They were not kissing yet when I opened the door, but they were clearly seconds away from that threshold, their body language and positioning leaving absolutely no ambiguity about what was transpiring or about to transpire. The engagement ring Daniel had purchased with money he had been saving for 2 years caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, the diamond flashing as Sophia's fingers twisted in Robert's shirt. That detail burned itself into my memory with particular vividness, the symbol of my son's love and commitment literally present in the moment his father and his fiancée were about to betray him in the most intimate way possible. The contrast between what that ring represented and what was actually occurring in my office created a cognitive dissonance so severe that I actually felt dizzy, my perception of reality fracturing in real time. They heard my gasp and froze in position like actors in a play who had forgotten their lines and were waiting for someone to prompt them about what came next. The frozen moment stretched out with surreal quality, time seeming to dilate and distort as my brain tried to catch up with the information my senses were providing. I watched Robert's hands drop from Sophia's face with guilty speed. I saw Sophia step backward and her expression shift from whatever she had been feeling seconds earlier into something that looked like panic mixed with defiance. I observed these details with strange clinical detachment, as if I were watching a scene involving strangers rather than my husband and my future daughter-in-law. Robert opened his mouth to speak, and I watched him search for words that might somehow explain or minimize what I had just witnessed. His face showed guilt and panic and calculation as he tried to determine what story might work, what explanation might be plausible enough to at least delay full confrontation. I had been married to this man for 28 years. I had watched him navigate countless difficult conversations and challenging situations throughout our decades together. I knew his expressions and his strategies and his tells when he was trying to manipulate a situation toward his preferred outcome. In that moment of watching him search for the right lie to tell me, something fundamental shifted in my perception. This was not a good man caught in a moment of weakness or poor judgment. This was a man who had been living a double life with sufficient skill that I had noticed nothing amiss despite sharing a home and a bed and supposedly a life built on honesty and trust. The betrayal was not just about whatever physical relationship he was conducting with Sophia. It was about the systematic deception required to maintain that relationship while pretending to be an excited father preparing to welcome his son's fiancée into our family. Before Robert could formulate whatever explanation he was preparing to offer, I held up one hand in a gesture that stopped him from speaking. The movement was instinctive rather than planned, my body taking action before my conscious mind had fully processed what response would be most strategic. I was not ready to hear his lies or his justifications. I was not prepared to engage in the kind of emotional confrontation that would inevitably follow any accusation or question I might pose. I needed time to think and plan and determine how to respond in ways that would protect my interests and my son's interests, rather than simply expressing the shock and rage flooding through my system. I smiled at both of them with an expression I could feel was not reaching my eyes. A social mask deployed automatically after decades of practice managing difficult interpersonal situations with surface grace regardless of internal turmoil. I told them in a voice that sounded remarkably calm and steady to carry on, those two words conveying dismissal and permission and something darker that I suspect neither of them fully registered in their panic about being discovered. Then I turned around with deliberate control, walked out of that office without looking back, and closed the door behind me with precise care rather than the slam my emotions demanded. I walked back down the hallway toward the kitchen where the catering coordinator was still waiting with her tablet and her questions about final guest count, and I somehow managed to complete that conversation with professional courtesy that gave no indication that my entire world had just detonated. I confirmed appetizer quantities and discussed timing for service and agreed on final arrangements while my mind raced with implications and consequences, and the beginning recognition that nothing about my life was what I had believed it to be. After the coordinator left, I stood in my kitchen alone for the first time since the discovery and felt my legs go weak enough that I had to grip the counter for support. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the past 15 minutes began to fade, replaced by waves of shock and nausea and rage so intense that I thought I might actually vomit right there on the floor of the kitchen where I had prepared thousands of family meals over nearly 3 decades. My hands were shaking badly enough that when I tried to pour myself a glass of water, I had to set the glass down and use both hands to steady the pitcher. The questions came flooding in faster than I could process them. How long had this been happening? When had it started? Had Robert pursued Sophia, or had she initiated whatever relationship they were conducting? Did Daniel suspect anything, or was he as blindly trusting as I had been? How many other people knew about this betrayal, and had been keeping it from me, while I planned an engagement party celebrating a union that was already corrupted beyond repair? Each question felt like another layer of betrayal being revealed, expanding the scope of deception beyond just the physical relationship to encompass the social conspiracy of silence that had apparently allowed it to continue. I heard movement in other parts of the house and realized that Robert and Sophia were likely discussing what to do about my discovery, probably trying to determine whether I would confront them immediately, or what story they should prepare if I did. The thought of them strategizing together in my own home, using my shock and their temporary alliance to manage the situation toward their preferred outcome, triggered something cold and strategic in me that I had not known existed beneath my usual approach to family conflict. I had spent 28 years being the accommodating spouse, the supportive partner who prioritized harmony and relationship maintenance over confrontation or demands for accountability. I had smoothed over countless conflicts, had accepted explanations that were probably incomplete or misleading, had told myself repeatedly that trust and generosity toward my husband's choices and behavior were signs of mature love, rather than naive passivity. That version of myself, the woman who would have immediately sought explanation and worked toward reconciliation, no longer existed. She had been killed in my home office when I walked in on a betrayal so profound that it eliminated any possibility of returning to the relationship dynamics that had characterized my marriage. The woman who remained after that death was someone I had never met before, someone capable of strategic thinking and calculated response rather than emotional reaction. I recognized intellectually that I was experiencing shock, and that my unnaturally calm state might give way to more difficult emotions once the immediate crisis passed. But I also understood with perfect clarity that whatever actions I took in the next hours and days would determine the trajectory of everything that followed, and that emotional indulgence right now would compromise my ability to protect myself and my son from the full consequences of this betrayal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I walked upstairs to my bedroom, the master suite that Robert and I had shared for 28 years, and locked the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed where I had slept beside him for thousands of nights and pulled out my phone with hands that had mostly stopped shaking. I needed information before I could determine appropriate response. I needed to understand the scope and duration of what I had discovered before I decided what actions would be most strategic. I opened Robert's laptop, which he had left on his nightstand that morning before going to his office downtown. He had never been particularly careful about security, had always used the same password variations for everything, because he found the cognitive burden of remembering multiple complex passwords annoying. I knew his patterns well enough that I had his laptop open within 2 attempts. What I found there would have been devastating if I had not already been emotionally numb from the initial discovery. The email account he apparently believed I never accessed contained months of correspondence with Sophia. The earliest messages dated back to last spring, shortly after Daniel had first introduced her to our family. The initial exchanges had been superficially innocent, Sophia asking Robert for advice about surprising Daniel for his birthday, Robert offering suggestions and asking questions about her background and career. But the tone had shifted within weeks from avuncular friendliness to something increasingly personal and inappropriate. By June, just 4 months into Daniel and Sophia's relationship, the emails between Robert and Sophia had progressed to overt flirtation. Robert was complimenting her appearance in ways that no father should address his son's girlfriend. Sophia was responding with messages that encouraged his attention and suggested she welcomed escalation. They were meeting for coffee during work hours, encounters that neither of them mentioned to Daniel or to me. They were texting constantly throughout days, creating a parallel relationship that existed alongside the family dinners and holiday gatherings, where they pretended to interact as future father-in-law and daughter-in-law. The messages from recent weeks were explicit enough that they left no doubt about the physical nature of their relationship. They had been intimate repeatedly over the past 2 months, finding opportunities whenever Daniel was traveling for work or when I was occupied with other commitments. They had been in my home during these encounters, using guest rooms and my office and probably my own bedroom when they felt sufficiently confident I would not return unexpectedly. The violation was not just about sexual betrayal, but about the colonization of my private space by people who felt entitled to conduct their affair in the environment I had created and maintained for my family. I photographed every significant email and text message exchange using my phone, creating documentation that I did not yet know how I would use but understood would be critical for whatever came next. The process was methodical and strangely calming, giving me concrete tasks that channeled the rage and hurt into productive activity. Each screenshot represented evidence that could not be denied or explained away, proof that what I had witnessed was not an isolated moment of weakness, but rather a sustained betrayal that had been ongoing for months while everyone pretended normalcy. The emails also revealed information about how Robert and Sophia had been discussing their situation, and their future. Robert had apparently told Sophia that his marriage to me had been emotionally dead for years, that we maintained appearances for family and social reasons but had no genuine intimacy or connection. This characterization of our marriage bore no resemblance to the relationship I believed we had been living, but it revealed how Robert had been framing our decades together to justify his pursuit of a woman young enough to be his daughter, a woman engaged to marry his son. Sophia had told Robert that she cared about Daniel, but did not feel the kind of passion with him that she experienced in Robert's presence. She had suggested multiple times that she was considering ending her engagement, but was afraid of the social and family consequences of that decision. Robert had encouraged her to be patient, to wait until after the engagement party to avoid creating immediate crisis, to allow time for them to determine whether their relationship had long-term potential before she made irreversible decisions about Daniel. Reading these strategic calculations about my son's emotional well-being and future, watching two people discuss his heartbreak as an acceptable cost of their romantic experimentation, triggered rage so intense that I had to set down my phone and practice breathing exercises to prevent myself from screaming or throwing something through a window. Daniel was my only child, a son I had raised with extraordinary care and devotion, a young man who had grown into someone genuinely good and decent despite the challenges of navigating contemporary life. He had introduced Sophia to us with such obvious pride and happiness, had shared his conviction that he had found someone with whom he could build a meaningful life, had asked for our blessing before proposing because our opinion and approval mattered deeply to him. Robert had given that blessing with apparent sincerity and enthusiasm, while already pursuing a sexual relationship with the woman our son wanted to marry. The level of betrayal involved in that particular deception was almost incomprehensible, requiring moral bankruptcy so profound that I wondered how I had shared a life with this man for 3 decades without seeing evidence of the character defects that would allow such behavior. Had he always been capable of this kind of cruelty, and I had simply been too naive or too invested in my marriage narrative to recognize the signs? Or had something fundamental shifted in him in recent years that I had failed to notice because I was not paying sufficiently close attention? The questions were overwhelming and ultimately unanswerable without confrontation that I was not ready to initiate. What I knew with certainty was that Saturday's engagement party could not proceed as planned. I could not stand in my home surrounded by family and friends celebrating a union that was already corrupted beyond salvage, watching Daniel's happy face while knowing that his fiancée and his father were conducting an affair that would destroy him when it inevitably came to light. I could not maintain the performance of normalcy for even one more evening, could not smile and play hostess and pretend that everything was fine when literally nothing was fine. But I also recognized that how I handled the revelation would have enormous consequences for Daniel, and for the rest of our extended family. If I confronted Robert and Sophia immediately in some dramatic emotional scene, I would be acting from hurt and rage rather than from strategic consideration of what outcome would be most protective of my son's interests. If I canceled the party without explanation, I would create speculation and questions that might reach Daniel before I had opportunity to tell him the truth in controlled circumstances. If I told Daniel immediately, he would have to process this betrayal while simultaneously dealing with the upcoming party, and the presence of dozens of guests who knew nothing about what had occurred. Every option available to me involved pain and difficulty and consequences that extended far beyond just my marriage to Robert. The betrayal had contaminated our entire family system, had created a crisis that would affect Daniel's life trajectory and emotional well-being, regardless of how skillfully I attempted to manage the disclosure and the aftermath. My choices in the next 48 hours would not prevent harm, but they might minimize it or at least ensure that the harm fell on the people who deserved to bear consequences rather than on my son who had done nothing except trust the wrong people. I sat in my locked bedroom for 3 hours that Thursday afternoon, methodically working through scenarios and outcomes and strategic considerations, until I had developed a plan that felt achievable, even if it was not emotionally satisfying. I would not cancel the party or confront Robert and Sophia before Saturday evening. Instead, I would allow the party to proceed exactly as planned, would smile and play hostess and maintain perfect composure while documenting every interaction between Robert and Sophia in front of witnesses who would later be able to confirm what they observed. Then, after the last guest departed, I would tell Daniel everything and present him with the evidence I had gathered so he could make informed decisions about his engagement and his relationship with his father. The plan required me to perform normalcy for 2 more days while living with full knowledge of the betrayal, required me to interact with Robert and Sophia as if nothing had changed, required me to maintain absolute control over my emotions and reactions regardless of provocation. It was perhaps the most difficult thing I had ever attempted, but it was also the most strategic approach available given the complicated family dynamics and the number of people whose lives would be affected by how this situation unfolded. I unlocked my bedroom door and went back downstairs to find Robert in the living room pretending to read a book, his body language tense with obvious anxiety about what I might do or say after the discovery. I walked past him without speaking, went into the kitchen, and began preparing dinner with the same routine I had followed thousands of times throughout our marriage. I heard him come to the kitchen doorway, sensed him watching me with confused uncertainty, waiting for the confrontation or the breakdown that he clearly expected. I continued chopping vegetables and seasoning chicken with focused attention to the task, refusing to acknowledge his presence or give him the engagement he was seeking. Robert finally asked in a carefully neutral voice whether everything was all right, and I felt a laugh bubble up in my chest that would have sounded unhinged if I had allowed it to escape. Instead, I turned to look at him with expression I knew projected calm indifference and told him that everything was fine, that I was simply focused on dinner preparation and final party details. I watched confusion and relief chase each other across his face as he tried to determine whether my reaction meant forgiveness or strategy, or something he had not anticipated. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time in our marriage, offering the excuse that I had developed a headache and did not want my restlessness to disturb his sleep since he had important client meetings the next day. Robert accepted the explanation without protest, probably grateful for the avoidance of whatever difficult conversation he was expecting. I lay awake in that unfamiliar bed staring at the ceiling and understanding that I had just taken the first action in what would become the systematic dismantling of my marriage, and the protection of my son from people who had proven themselves unworthy of his trust and love. The next 2 days would test every skill I had developed over nearly 3 decades of managing complex social situations and maintaining grace under pressure. But I had spent those decades building capabilities that would now be deployed toward ending my marriage rather than sustaining it, and that transformation felt like reclaiming power I had given away without ever meaning to. Robert and Sophia had made the catastrophic error of assuming that my history of accommodation and conflict avoidance meant I was incapable of strategic response to genuine betrayal. They were about to discover exactly how wrong that assumption was, and by the time they understood their mistake, the consequences would already be irreversible. Friday morning arrived with deceptive ordinariness, sunlight streaming through the guest room windows where I had spent a largely sleepless night planning the next 48 hours with obsessive attention to detail. My body ached from tension I had been carrying since the discovery, muscles tight across my shoulders and neck in ways that would have been debilitating if I allowed myself to acknowledge the physical manifestations of stress. Instead, I rose at my usual time, showered with mechanical efficiency, and dressed in clothing that projected the capable competence I had cultivated over decades of managing complex family and professional obligations. Robert was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, drinking coffee and scrolling through his phone with studied casualness that did not quite conceal the tension in his posture. He looked up when I entered and I watched him assess my expression and demeanor, clearly trying to determine whether yesterday's apparent calm had been genuine acceptance or merely delayed reaction that might still materialize into confrontation. I offered him a neutral good morning, poured my own coffee, and began reviewing my list of final party preparations without any acknowledgement of what had occurred in my office 20 hours earlier. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken complexity, but I had committed to my strategy and would not deviate regardless of discomfort. Robert made several attempts at normal marital conversation, asking about my plans for the day and mentioning details about his own work schedule, his voice carrying an undertone of relief that suggested he was interpreting my composure as evidence that the situation might somehow resolve without significant consequences. I responded to his questions with minimal courtesy, providing factual information without emotional content or invitation for deeper engagement. What Robert could not see was the calculation occurring behind my calm exterior, the constant mental review of evidence I had gathered and plans I was refining for Saturday evening's revelation. Every interaction with him now served strategic purposes beyond immediate social necessity. I was observing his behavior with new attention to patterns I had previously dismissed or rationalized, cataloging details that would inform how I managed the divorce proceedings that would inevitably follow this weekend. I was also practicing the emotional discipline that would be required to maintain composure through an entire evening of hosting, while knowing that the party's nominal purpose had been corrupted beyond salvage. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia asking whether she could come by that morning to help with party preparations, her message cheerful and apparently unconcerned despite yesterday's discovery. The audacity of that communication momentarily broke through my controlled detachment, rage flaring hot enough that I had to set down my coffee cup to prevent my shaking hands from revealing the intensity of my reaction. She was going to pretend that nothing significant had occurred, was going to continue playing the role of helpful future daughter-in-law, as if I had not witnessed her seconds away from kissing my husband in my own office. I responded that her help would be appreciated and suggested she arrive around 10 o'clock, my message matching her tone of casual friendliness while providing no indication of the fury and disgust driving my actual emotional state. If Sophia wanted to perform normalcy, I would give her that opportunity while documenting every false smile and manufactured intimacy for use in eventual conversations with my son. She would have no idea that her performance was being observed and recorded not as genuine family interaction, but as evidence of character defects that rendered her unworthy of the trust Daniel had placed in her. Robert left for his office shortly after 8, kissing my cheek in automatic gesture of marital routine that made my skin crawl with revulsion I could not allow myself to express. I stood at the kitchen sink after he departed and scrubbed my hands with water hot enough to hurt, washing away the contamination of his touch while recognizing that no amount of physical cleaning could address the psychological violation of discovering that the person I had trusted most completely had been systematically betraying that trust for months. The marriage I had believed in no longer existed and perhaps had never existed in the form I imagined, but the performance of that marriage had to continue for another 36 hours until I could dismantle it under circumstances that protected my son. I spent the next 90 minutes before Sophia's arrival conducting additional evidence gathering that Patricia Wolfe, the attorney I had consulted by phone Thursday evening, had recommended. Patricia specialized in high-asset divorce cases and had reputation for aggressive advocacy that protected her clients' interests while maintaining professional standards that withstood judicial scrutiny. During our initial conversation, she had emphasized the importance of documenting financial accounts, property ownership records, and any evidence of asset dissipation or hidden resources that might become relevant during divorce proceedings. I photographed statements from our joint bank accounts and investment portfolios, noting that Robert had made several large cash withdrawals over the past 3 months that had no obvious explanation based on our normal spending patterns. I documented the property deed showing that our home had been purchased primarily with inheritance money from my parents, a fact that would be legally significant in determining asset division. I compiled records of my financial contributions to our household throughout our marriage, the consulting income one had generated while also managing all domestic responsibilities that had allowed Robert to focus entirely on his career advancement. The documentation process revealed patterns I had not consciously registered during the years when I was living within the marriage rather than analyzing it from outside. Robert had been systematically positioning himself to control our joint assets while minimizing my access to financial information and decision-making authority. He had suggested repeatedly over the past year that I should reduce my consulting work to focus more on family and household management, advice I had partially accepted because I valued the flexibility of reduced professional commitments and trusted that our financial security was being managed appropriately through his career success. Now I understood those suggestions as part of deliberate strategy to increase my economic dependence and reduce my ability to leave the marriage with resources sufficient to maintain independent stability. Whether that strategy had been conscious preparation for ending our marriage on his terms, or simply reflexive patriarchal control that he exercised without examining his motivations was unclear. Either way, the pattern demonstrated that Robert had been thinking about power and resources in ways that prioritized his interests over partnership considerations, and that realization transformed my understanding of our entire marital history. Sophia arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, carrying flowers she had apparently purchased as hostess gift, her smile bright and her manner suggesting she genuinely believed we would simply proceed as if Thursday afternoon had not occurred. I accepted the flowers with gracious thanks that revealed none of my actual feelings, invited her inside with hospitality that felt like swallowing glass, and directed her toward party preparation tasks that would keep her occupied and visible while I continued my own work in adjacent spaces. Watching Sophia move through my home with casual familiarity, touching furniture and objects that represented decades of my life and effort, triggered visceral reactions I had to suppress through conscious breathing and deliberate focus on longer-term objectives. She was young enough to be my daughter, barely 26 to Robert's 53, and the age differential added another dimension of wrongness to their relationship beyond the betrayal of Daniel. Robert was not simply conducting an affair with someone inappropriate due to existing family connections. He was pursuing someone young enough that their relationship reflected pathological narcissism and inability to accept the natural aging process that came with being a man in his 50s. Throughout the morning, Sophia made several comments about how excited she was to officially join our family, how grateful she felt that Robert and I had welcomed her so warmly, how she hoped to build the kind of close relationship with me that she had never had with her own mother, who had passed away when Sophia was a teenager. Each statement felt like calculated manipulation designed to make me complicit in whatever narrative she had constructed to justify her relationship with Robert. She was apparently skilled at emotional performance, at saying things that sounded vulnerable and authentic, while actually serving strategic purposes related to managing perceptions and securing her position. I responded to her comments with appropriate warmth and maternal interest, playing my assigned role in her performance while internally cataloging every false note and manipulative tactic for future reference. At one point, she mentioned that Robert had been so helpful in giving her advice about navigating family dynamics and professional challenges, that she felt fortunate to have his guidance as she adjusted to becoming part of our family. The statement was clearly designed to normalize their private contact and establish innocent explanation for time they had spent together, preemptively defending against any questions I might raise about the appropriateness of their relationship. I smiled and agreed that Robert had always been generous with mentorship and support, my voice steady and my expression conveying nothing except pleased agreement with her characterization. Inside, I was marveling at the sophisticated nature of her deception, the advanced planning that had gone into creating cover stories and plausible explanations for behavior that would otherwise raise immediate suspicion. Sophia was not simply young and impulsive, making poor decisions without fully considering consequences. She was calculating and strategic, conducting her affair with my husband while simultaneously building relationships with me, and with Daniel that would provide social protection and delayed discovery. We worked together through the afternoon on final party preparations, arranging furniture and setting tables and coordinating with vendors who arrived to deliver rental equipment and floral arrangements. The domestic collaboration would have appeared to any observer as a lovely example of mother and future daughter-in-law building relationship through shared activity. The reality was that I was performing one of the most difficult acts of my entire life, maintaining surface normalcy while internally experiencing rage and disgust so intense that I occasionally had to excuse myself to bathrooms where I could grip counters and practice breathing exercises that prevented complete emotional breakdown. Daniel called in the late afternoon to confirm his arrival time for Saturday, and to express his excitement about the party and his gratitude for all the preparation work I had done to make the event special. Hearing his voice, so full of happiness and trust and anticipation for a future that was already destroyed whether he knew it yet or not, nearly broke through the careful control I had been maintaining all day. I told him I loved him and I was proud of him and I looked forward to celebrating with him tomorrow. Each statement completely true while carrying meanings he could not yet understand. After the call ended, I sat alone in my bedroom and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to cry, tears of grief and rage that I had been suppressing for 30 hours finally releasing in a private space where no one could witness or question my emotional state. Then I washed my face, reapplied makeup that concealed the evidence of crying, and returned downstairs to continue the performance that would extend through another full day, before I could finally stop pretending and start actively dismantling the lies that had contaminated my family. Robert came home that evening with takeout dinner from a restaurant we had frequented throughout our marriage, his gesture apparently intended as peace offering or attempt to reestablish normal marital routines that might indicate we were moving past Thursday's discovery without sustained conflict. I accepted the food with neutral thanks and we ate together at our kitchen table with conversation that remained carefully superficial, discussing party logistics and extended family members who would be attending and other safe topics that required no emotional authenticity or genuine connection. At one point, Robert reached across the table to touch my hand, his expression suggesting he wanted to address what had occurred, but was uncertain how to initiate that conversation. I withdrew my hand with movement smooth enough that it might have appeared unconscious rather than deliberate rejection, and I redirected conversation toward final party details that required his input about alcohol quantities and parking arrangements. I watched relief and confusion compete in his expression as he apparently tried to determine whether I was avoiding difficult conversation because I had decided to forgive and move forward, or because I was planning something he had not anticipated. The answer was obvious to me but apparently remained opaque to Robert despite his decades of experience reading my moods and reactions. I was avoiding conversation because anything I said before Saturday evening would be wasted energy that served no strategic purpose. Robert would have opportunities to explain and justify and apologize after Daniel knew the truth, and after I had filed for divorce with Patricia's guidance. Until then, words between us were meaningless performance that I would participate in only to the extent necessary to maintain my cover until the planned revelation. That night, I again slept in the guest room, offering the same excuse about wanting to ensure good rest before the party, and not wanting to disturb Robert with my anticipated restlessness. He accepted the explanation with visible disappointment but without protest, and I spent another largely sleepless night reviewing my plan for Saturday evening and mentally rehearsing the conversation I would have with Daniel after the guests departed. The conversation that would destroy his happiness and trust, but would also give him information he needed to make informed decisions about his engagement and his future. Saturday morning brought activity that left little time for reflection or emotional processing. Vendors began arriving at 8 to set up tables and chairs, sound equipment for the quartet, and bar service areas in our expanded living room and adjoining sunroom. I coordinated logistics with practiced efficiency, managing multiple simultaneous tasks, while maintaining surface calm that gave no indication of the internal turmoil I was experiencing. Robert was helpful throughout the setup process, carrying furniture and assisting with arrangements, his behavior suggesting he believed we had successfully moved past Thursday's discovery into some form of unspoken reconciliation, or at least peaceful coexistence. He made several joking comments to vendors about the elaborate nature of the party, and the lengths we were going to in order to celebrate our son's engagement, his tone affectionate and proud in ways that would have seemed genuine to anyone who did not know about his affair with the woman we were supposedly celebrating as our future daughter-in-law. I watched him perform the role of devoted father and supportive husband and marveled at the disconnect between his public presentation and his actual behavior. This was not compartmentalization or cognitive dissonance. This was sociopathic comfort with duplicity, the ability to maintain completely contradictory positions simultaneously without apparent internal conflict. The man I had been married to for 28 years was fundamentally different from the person I had believed him to be, and that recognition was almost more disturbing than the affair itself. Sophia arrived at 2 in the afternoon to help with final preparations and to dress for the party in one of our guest rooms, her overnight bag suggesting she had planned to stay at our house after the event rather than returning to the apartment she supposedly maintained independently. I wondered with bitter humor whether she had been planning to sleep in our guest room, or whether she and Robert had some other arrangement that would have played out if I had not discovered them Thursday afternoon. The casualness with which she moved through these plans suggested she had become comfortable treating my home as extension of whatever relationship she was conducting with my husband. Daniel arrived at 4, 3 hours before guests were expected, his face glowing with happiness as he hugged me and thanked me repeatedly for organizing such a beautiful celebration. I held him longer than usual, breathing in the familiar scent of the cologne he had worn since high school and memorizing the feeling of his embrace before everything changed. He had no idea that this party marking the beginning of his new life chapter was actually the end of something, that by tomorrow morning his engagement would be over and his relationship with his father would be permanently damaged if not completely destroyed. As I released him from the hug and stepped back to look at his happy face, I felt my resolve waver for the first time since making my plan. Perhaps I should tell him now, before the party, give him opportunity to cancel or postpone rather than forcing him to maintain composure through an evening of celebration while privately devastated by truth he had just learned. But that approach would be self-indulgent rather than strategic, would spare me the difficulty of performing through the evening, but would place that burden on Daniel instead while also creating immediate crisis in front of arriving vendors and family members. I had committed to a plan that protected Daniel as much as possible given impossible circumstances, and I would execute that plan regardless of how difficult it became for me personally. The remainder of the afternoon passed in blur of final preparations and arriving guests and the beginning of the party itself, me moving through roles and conversations with automatic grace while internally counting down hours until I could finally stop performing and start addressing reality. The first guests arrived at 7 o'clock precisely, my sister Margaret and her husband Tom bringing with them the warm energy of family members who had known Daniel since birth and genuinely celebrated his happiness without complication or hidden agenda. Margaret embraced me with the fierce protectiveness of a younger sibling, who had always been able to read my moods beneath whatever social facade I presented, and I felt her pause slightly as she registered the tension I was carrying despite my composed exterior. She pulled back to study my face with concern beginning to show in her expression, but I shook my head almost imperceptibly and redirected her attention toward Daniel, who was greeting other arriving guests with the enthusiastic hospitality that had always characterized his approach to social gatherings. Within 30 minutes, our home filled with the 40 guests I had carefully invited over the preceding weeks, each person representing some dimension of our family history or Daniel's life journey. There were cousins and aunts and uncles from both sides of the extended family, college friends who had maintained close contact with Daniel through his 20s, professional colleagues from the architecture firm where he had been building his career for the past 4 years, and neighbors who had watched him grow up and felt invested in his happiness. The gathering represented exactly the kind of community celebration I had envisioned when planning the party, everyone genuinely pleased to honor Daniel and welcome Sophia into the complex web of relationships that constituted our family network. I moved through the evening in something resembling an out-of-body experience, simultaneously present and completely detached from the social performance occurring around me. I greeted guests with warmth that appeared entirely genuine, made small talk about their lives and their families with interest that seemed authentic, ensured that food and drink circulated smoothly, and that every person felt welcomed and attended to with the gracious hospitality I had perfected over decades of hosting family events. No one observing my behavior would have detected anything unusual or strained. I was performing at the absolute peak of my social capabilities, channeling every skill I had developed throughout my adult life into maintaining an illusion of normalcy, while internally experiencing emotional devastation, so complete that I occasionally felt dizzy from the effort of remaining upright and functional. What transformed the evening from merely difficult performance into something strategically valuable was my decision to observe and document every interaction between Robert and Sophia, in ways that would provide evidence for the conversations I would have with Daniel after the party ended. I had positioned my phone discreetly to capture video of key areas where guests congregated, creating a record that would demonstrate patterns of behavior that might otherwise be dismissed as misperception or overreaction on my part. I was not relying on my own testimony alone to convince Daniel of what had been occurring. I was building a comprehensive case that would withstand his initial resistance and his natural desire to believe that people he loved had not betrayed him so profoundly. The interactions I observed throughout the evening revealed dynamics I had been too trusting or too distracted to notice during previous family gatherings. Robert and Sophia maintained careful physical distance in spaces where other guests could observe them directly, but in transitional areas and momentary privacy, they demonstrated familiarity and intimacy that went far beyond appropriate future father-in-law and daughter-in-law connection. I watched Robert's hand rest on the small of Sophia's back as he guided her through a doorway, the gesture lasting several seconds longer than necessary and his fingers spreading in a way that suggested ownership and intimate knowledge of her body. I observed Sophia lean close to Robert while ostensibly asking him a question about drink preferences, her mouth near his ear and her hand touching his arm in a manner that conveyed private communication rather than casual social interaction. During dinner service, when guests were seated at tables arranged throughout our expanded living areas, I noticed that Robert and Sophia had somehow positioned themselves at the same table despite my careful planning that should have separated them to opposite sides of the room. They were not seated directly beside each other, maintaining plausible deniability about any intentional arrangement, but they were diagonal from each other in positions that allowed constant eye contact and private communication through facial expressions that excluded the other guests at their table. I watched them share smiles and meaningful glances while Daniel sat at a different table entirely, surrounded by his college friends and completely unaware that his fiancée and his father were conducting a silent conversation that had nothing to do with the engagement being celebrated. The most damning interaction occurred when Robert volunteered to help me retrieve additional champagne from our basement storage area, a task that should have taken perhaps 2 minutes but extended to nearly 10. I followed them down after waiting a strategic interval, moving quietly on the stairs so my approach would not be immediately detected. What I found was Robert and Sophia standing close together near the wine racks, their body language suggesting they had just stepped apart from physical contact when they heard my footsteps. Sophia's face was flushed and her expression showed guilt mixed with defiance, while Robert looked startled and then carefully neutral as he turned toward me with champagne bottles in his hands and an explanation already forming about how he had needed Sophia's help carrying multiple bottles. I accepted the explanation without comment or visible reaction, took one of the bottles from his hands, and returned upstairs with them following behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples, but my external composure remained perfectly intact. The basement encounter had provided exactly the kind of evidence I needed to demonstrate to Daniel that their relationship involved active ongoing physical intimacy, rather than just historical mistakes or momentary lapses in judgment they might try to characterize as aberrations rather than patterns. Throughout the evening, I also observed how Sophia interacted with Daniel when they were together in public view, and the contrast with her behavior toward Robert was instructive in ways that would be important for helping my son understand what he was actually dealing with rather than what he imagined his relationship to be. With Daniel, Sophia was affectionate in ways that appeared performative rather than genuine, her touches and smiles seeming calculated to project the image of devoted fiancée, rather than arising from authentic feeling. She would initiate public displays of affection when other guests were watching, kissing Daniel's cheek or taking his hand in gestures that seemed designed to be observed and remarked upon rather than expressions of spontaneous affection. When she thought no one was paying particular attention, Sophia's engagement with Daniel became noticeably less animated. Her smiles faded into neutral expressions that suggested boredom or distraction. Her body language shifted from oriented toward him to positioned in ways that allowed her to maintain visual contact with Robert across the room. She checked her phone repeatedly during conversations with Daniel, her attention divided in ways that would have hurt him if he had been less trusting or more observant of the subtle signs that someone's focus was elsewhere even when they appeared to be present. I found myself feeling protective fury on Daniel's behalf that was somehow even more intense than the rage I felt about Robert's betrayal of our marriage. My son deserved a partner who was genuinely invested in building a life with him, someone who valued his qualities and felt fortunate to have his love and commitment, rather than viewing him as acceptable placeholder while pursuing other options. Sophia was using Daniel's trust and devotion as cover for a relationship with his father, exploiting his good faith and his assumption that people who claimed to care about him were acting with basic integrity and honesty. That exploitation was predatory in ways that made my decision to expose her seem not just personally necessary but morally obligatory. The evening reached its ceremonial peak when Daniel and Sophia stood together in the center of our living room and Daniel offered a toast thanking everyone for celebrating with them, expressing his excitement about their future together, and acknowledging with particular warmth the support and example that Robert and I had provided through our own long marriage. His voice carried genuine emotion as he talked about hoping to build the kind of lasting partnership his parents had demonstrated, about wanting to create for his own future children the stable and loving home environment he had been fortunate enough to experience growing up. Every word he spoke was sincere and heartfelt, completely unaware that the marriage he was celebrating as his model had been revealed to be a lie, and that one of the two people he was toasting had been systematically betraying him for months. I raised my glass along with everyone else in the room and drank to Daniel's happiness while feeling tears threaten to overwhelm the careful control I had maintained all evening. I would not cry at this party, would not give Robert or Sophia any indication that my composure was anything other than complete, but the effort of containing my grief and rage while listening to my son express gratitude and hope was almost more than I could sustain. I caught Margaret's eyes across the room and saw that she was watching me with obvious concern now, her expression making clear that she knew something was seriously wrong even if she did not yet understand what or how bad the situation actually was. Robert offered his own toast immediately following Daniel's remarks, speaking about his pride in his son and his joy at welcoming Sophia into our family, his words smooth and apparently genuine in ways that would have been completely convincing to anyone who did not know about his affair. He talked about marriage requiring work and commitment and mutual respect, offering advice to the young couple based on the lessons he had supposedly learned through nearly 3 decades with me. The hypocrisy was so profound that I briefly considered standing up and exposing everything right then, revealing to the entire assembled gathering exactly what kind of man Robert actually was beneath his performance of devoted husband and father. But that impulse was emotional rather than strategic, driven by rage rather than by consideration of what approach would be most protective of Daniel, and most effective in achieving the outcomes I had determined were necessary. I remained silent and smiling, allowing Robert's false testimony to stand unchallenged for the moment while knowing that his words were being recorded and would eventually be played back to him as evidence of his willingness to lie in public while knowing that everything he was saying was completely contradicted by his actual behavior. The party continued for another 2 hours after the toasts, guests lingering over dessert and coffee while conversations fragmented into smaller groups throughout our home and out onto the garden patio where the evening had turned pleasantly cool. I continued performing my role as gracious hostess, ensuring everyone had what they needed and facilitating introductions between guests who had not previously met, maintaining the social energy that made the event feel successful and meaningful, rather than allowing any awkwardness or tension to develop that might raise questions or concern. Margaret cornered me in the kitchen during a brief moment when I was alone, her hands gripping my arms as she asked directly what was wrong and whether I was all right. I looked at my sister, who had known me for my entire life, and who would support whatever decisions I made regardless of how dramatic or difficult they might be. And I told her quietly that I could not discuss it yet, but that I would need her help tomorrow. Her expression shifted from concern to alarm as she registered the seriousness in my tone, but she simply nodded and hugged me tightly before releasing me to return to the party, trusting that I would explain when I was ready, and that whatever was happening was being handled as well as possible given circumstances she did not yet understand. The final guests departed around 11 o'clock, offering their congratulations one last time and thanking me for a beautiful evening as they moved toward the door. I accepted their gratitude with warmth and appreciation that masked my desperate desire for everyone to leave, so I could finally stop performing and begin the process of revealing truth that would shatter the happy occasion we had just concluded. Daniel and Sophia lingered after the other guests had gone, helping to collect glasses and plates in that automatic way that family members participate in cleanup without needing to be asked. I told them to leave the cleanup for tomorrow, that I was exhausted and wanted everyone to simply go to bed, and we would deal with the aftermath of the party in the morning when we were all rested. Sophia mentioned that she had planned to stay overnight in our guest room since it was late and she had been drinking throughout the evening, and I agreed with surface graciousness while internally recognizing that her plan had likely been to find opportunity to be alone with Robert at some point during the night. That plan was not going to materialize because I had already decided that tonight was when Daniel would learn everything. When the performance would finally end and reality would have to be confronted regardless of how painful or difficult that confrontation became. Daniel hugged me goodnight and told me again how grateful he was for the beautiful party, how much it meant to him that I had put so much effort into celebrating this milestone in his life. I held him close and told him I loved him more than anything in the world, and that everything I did was motivated by wanting what was best for him, my words carrying meanings he would understand very soon. He smiled at me with complete trust and affection, kissed my cheek, and headed upstairs to the guest room where he would be sleeping, completely unaware that within the next hour his entire understanding of his family and his relationship would be irrevocably altered. Robert had already gone upstairs to our bedroom, apparently confident that the evening had proceeded smoothly, and that whatever tension had existed since Thursday's discovery had been successfully managed through avoidance and the normalizing effect of the party itself. Sophia remained in the kitchen with me for a moment, commenting on how well the evening had gone and how happy Daniel seemed, her tone suggesting she felt some combination of relief that the party was over and satisfaction that she had successfully maintained her performance throughout the evening without any direct confrontation or exposure. I looked at this young woman who had infiltrated my family through a relationship with my son, and then betrayed that relationship by pursuing his father, and I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. She had no idea that her time of operating without consequences was measured in minutes now rather than days or weeks. She had no understanding that the composure I had maintained throughout the evening was not acceptance or forgiveness, but rather strategic delay that had served purposes she would only recognize retrospectively once the full scope of my response became clear. I told Sophia goodnight with tone that conveyed dismissal, and she headed upstairs to the guest room she would be occupying, passing Daniel's room on her way with no indication that she felt any guilt or conflict about sleeping under the same roof as the young man whose trust she had been systematically violating. After she disappeared up the stairs, I stood alone in my kitchen and allowed myself 30 seconds of pure feeling, The rage and grief and determination that I had been suppressing all evening finally surfacing now that there were no witnesses who required managed impressions. Then I walked to Daniel's door and knocked softly, asking if he was still awake and whether I could speak with him about something important. He opened the door in his pajamas, his expression shifting from relaxed contentment to concern as he registered something in my voice or demeanor that signaled this was not a casual good-night conversation. I asked him to come downstairs with me, that what I needed to discuss required privacy and his full attention and could not wait until morning despite the late hour and his fatigue from the evening. Daniel followed me down to the living room where just an hour earlier we had been celebrating his engagement, and I directed him to sit on the couch while I retrieved my phone and the laptop I had prepared with all the evidence I had gathered over the past 2 days. The moment had finally arrived when I would stop protecting him from painful truth, and instead give him the information he needed to make informed decisions about his future, regardless of how much immediate suffering that information would cause. My hands were remarkably steady as I sat down beside him and began the conversation that would end his engagement and transform his relationship with his father forever. The conversation I had been planning and dreading in equal measure since the moment I had discovered Robert and Sophia in my office 3 days earlier. Daniel sat beside me on the couch where we had hosted 40 guests just hours earlier, his expression reflecting confusion mixed with growing concern as he registered the seriousness of whatever conversation I was preparing to initiate. The living room still carried traces of the party that had just concluded, empty champagne flutes on side tables, and the lingering scent of the floral arrangements I had ordered specifically for this occasion. The contrast between the celebratory atmosphere that had filled this space an hour ago, and the devastating conversation that was about to occur in the same location felt almost unbearably cruel, but there was no gentle way to deliver information that would fundamentally alter my son's understanding of his relationships and his future. I took a deep breath that did nothing to settle the anxiety coursing through my system, and began speaking in a voice I worked to keep steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm my composure. I told Daniel that I loved him completely, and that everything I was about to share with him was motivated by that love, and by my fundamental commitment to his well-being, even when protecting him required causing immediate pain. I explained that I had discovered something on Thursday afternoon that had made it impossible for me to continue allowing him to proceed with his engagement without full knowledge of circumstances that would inevitably emerge eventually, and would be far more devastating if he learned about them after marriage rather than before. Daniel's face had gone pale before I even began sharing specific information, some instinctive recognition that whatever was coming was serious enough to warrant this kind of formal introduction and late-night conversation. He asked me directly what had happened, his voice carrying an edge of fear that made my heart break even as I steeled myself to continue. I had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times over the past 2 days, had tried to determine the most direct yet compassionate way to deliver information that would shatter his happiness and trust, but no amount of preparation made the actual moment of revelation any easier. I told Daniel that on Thursday afternoon I had walked into my home office and found his father and his fiancée in an intimate embrace, their faces inches apart and their body language making absolutely clear that they were seconds away from kissing when I interrupted them. I watched the words register on his face, saw confusion shift to disbelief, and then to a kind of sick recognition that suggested some part of him had perhaps noticed things he had not consciously acknowledged or allowed himself to question. He started to interrupt with what I assumed would be denial or alternative explanation, but I held up my hand and told him I needed him to listen to everything before responding, that what I had witnessed Thursday was not an isolated incident but rather evidence of a pattern that had been ongoing for months. I opened the laptop I had prepared and showed Daniel the email correspondence between Robert and Sophia, the messages that documented the evolution of their relationship from inappropriate friendliness to overt affair over the course of the past 6 months. I watched my son read through exchanges that made clear his fiancée and his father had been meeting regularly, had been physically intimate repeatedly, had been discussing their relationship and their feelings while simultaneously maintaining their respective connections to Daniel as if those connections were somehow compatible with the betrayal they were conducting. Daniel's hands were shaking as he scrolled through the emails, his breathing becoming increasingly rapid and shallow in ways that made me worry he might be approaching panic attack territory. His face had transformed from pale confusion to a kind of gray shock that suggested he was processing trauma in real time, his entire reality restructuring around information that contradicted everything he had believed about the people closest to him. I sat beside him in silence, allowing him time to absorb what he was reading without rushing him toward any particular response or reaction, simply maintaining supportive presence while he confronted betrayal so profound that no words could adequately address the scope of harm that had been inflicted. After perhaps 10 minutes of reading, Daniel set down the laptop with movements that seemed to require enormous effort, as if his body had become unbearably heavy. He turned to look at me with eyes that appeared decades older than they had been an hour earlier, and he asked in a voice barely above a whisper whether I was certain about what the emails meant, whether there was any possibility that I was misinterpreting friendly communication as something more inappropriate. The question was not genuine skepticism but rather desperate hope that somehow the evidence could be explained away, that the nightmare he was experiencing might still be revealed as misunderstanding rather than actual betrayal by the two people whose love and loyalty he had never thought to question. I told Daniel gently but firmly that I had witnessed them physically together on Thursday, that I had observed their interactions throughout the party this evening in ways that confirmed ongoing intimacy rather than historical mistake they had corrected, and that the email evidence was unambiguous about both the duration and the physical nature of their relationship. I explained that I had waited to tell him until after the party not because I doubted what I knew to be true, but because I wanted to give him time to process this information in private rather than forcing him to manage his emotional response in front of dozens of guests who knew nothing about the situation. Daniel stood up abruptly and began pacing the living room with agitation that suggested he was struggling to contain the overwhelming emotions flooding his system. He asked why his father would do something like this. What possible explanation could exist for a man to pursue his son's fiancée in violation of every principle of parental love and basic human decency? He asked what he had done wrong in his relationship with Sophia that would make her seek connection with someone else. Whether there were problems he had failed to notice or needs he had failed to meet that had driven her to his father. The self-blame in his questions was heartbreaking and entirely unwarranted, reflecting the tendency of betrayed people to assume they must have somehow caused or deserved the mistreatment they experienced. I stopped his pacing by standing and gripping his shoulders, forcing him to look at me directly while I told him with absolute conviction that none of this was his fault, that he had done nothing wrong and had no responsibility for the choices that Robert and Sophia had made independently and deliberately. I explained that people who betray trust do so because of their own character defects, and their own willingness to prioritize immediate gratification over integrity, and the well-being of people who depend on them. I told him that both Robert and Sophia had demonstrated through their actions that they lacked the fundamental moral capacity required to be trustworthy partners, and that this revelation was devastating but also ultimately protective, because it prevented him from building his life on foundations that would have eventually collapsed in even more damaging ways. Daniel asked whether I had confronted them, whether Robert had offered any explanation or shown any remorse for what he had done. I explained my decision to maintain composure and gather evidence, rather than engaging in immediate emotional confrontation, walking him through the strategic thinking that had guided my response over the past 2 days. I told him that I had already consulted with a divorce attorney, and would be filing papers early next week, that I had documented financial information, and secured evidence that would protect my interests during the legal proceedings that would follow. I explained that I was sharing all of this with him not to burden him with my own crisis, but to help him understand that strategic response to betrayal was possible, even when immediate emotional reaction felt overwhelming. My son looked at me with something approaching awe mixed with his grief, and he said he could not believe I had maintained composure through the entire party while knowing what I knew, that he would have thought such performance was impossible under those circumstances. I told him that it had been one of the most difficult things I had ever done, but that protecting him from having to process this information in front of guests had made the difficulty worthwhile, that sometimes loving someone meant carrying burdens privately so they could be shielded from unnecessary additional harm. I explained that he would need to make his own decisions about how to proceed with his engagement and his relationship with his father, but that I would support whatever choices he made while also being honest about my own assessment that both relationships had been revealed as fundamentally corrupted beyond any possibility of healthy continuation. Daniel asked whether Sophia was still upstairs in our guest room, whether she had been planning to sleep here tonight with no apparent concern about the betrayal she had been conducting. I confirmed that she was in the guest room and had seemed completely comfortable making those arrangements, suggesting that she felt either no guilt about her behavior or sufficient confidence in her ability to manage the situation that she saw no reason to avoid continued presence in our home. Daniel's expression hardened in ways I had rarely seen, his grief beginning to transform into anger that was more familiar and manageable than the initial shock and self-blame that had characterized his early reaction. He stood from the couch with sudden decision and announced that he was going to confront Sophia immediately, that she was going to explain herself and answer for what she had done. I cautioned him to consider whether late-night confrontation in our home was the best setting for that conversation, whether he might want to take time to process his emotions before engaging directly with someone who had proven herself to be manipulative and willing to lie. Daniel acknowledged the wisdom of that advice but said he could not spend the night under the same roof as Sophia without addressing what he now knew, that continuing any pretense of normalcy was beyond his current capacity even if strategic delay might serve longer-term interests. I told him I understood and would support whatever approach he chose, but that I wanted to be present during any confrontation that occurred in my home to serve as witness, and to ensure that Sophia did not attempt to manipulate the situation or gaslight Daniel about what had actually occurred. He agreed immediately, apparently relieved to have support during a conversation that would be extraordinarily difficult regardless of how it unfolded. Together we walked upstairs to the guest room where Sophia was presumably sleeping, and Daniel knocked on the door with force that made clear this was not a gentle social call. Sophia opened the door after a moment, her expression shifting from sleepy confusion to alarm as she registered both Daniel's presence and mine standing behind him in the hallway. She asked what was wrong in a voice that attempted casual concern but carried an undertone of guilt that suggested she immediately suspected the reason for this late-night visit. Daniel did not waste time with polite preliminaries or careful lead-in to difficult subject matter. He asked her directly how long she had been sleeping with his father, his voice carrying controlled fury that was more intimidating than shouting would have been. Sophia's face went through a rapid series of expressions, as she apparently assessed her options and determined what strategy might serve her interests in this moment of exposure. She initially attempted denial, claiming that Daniel was confused or had misunderstood something, that whatever he thought he knew was not accurate. Daniel cut off her denials by informing her that I had witnessed them together on Thursday, that he had read their email correspondence documenting months of affair, and that her options were to tell the truth or to leave our house immediately without further conversation. The directness of that ultimatum seemed to break through Sophia's attempt at manipulative denial, and her expression shifted to something combining defiance with calculated vulnerability. She admitted that she and Robert had developed feelings for each other, but characterized their relationship as emotional connection that had progressed further than either of them intended, as if they had been passive victims of overwhelming attraction, rather than active agents making deliberate choices to betray Daniel. She claimed that she still cared about Daniel, but had come to recognize that her relationship with Robert was more profound and genuine than what she had with Daniel, that discovering real passion had made her realize she had been settling for comfortable affection, rather than true love. The narcissism and cruelty of that characterization, delivered to my son who had proposed to her with genuine love and commitment just months earlier, was so breathtaking that I actually stepped forward with instinct to physically intervene before I consciously registered what I was doing. Daniel held up his hand to stop me, his gesture making clear that he needed to handle this confrontation himself without my interference regardless of how much I wanted to protect him from additional harm. He told Sophia with remarkable composure that she needed to pack her belongings and leave our house immediately, that their engagement was over and he never wanted to see or speak to her again. Sophia began to cry, tears that appeared practiced rather than genuine, and she reached toward Daniel while saying that they needed to talk about this properly, that ending everything in the middle of the night without real conversation was not fair to either of them. Daniel stepped back from her attempted touch and repeated his instruction that she leave immediately, his voice carrying finality that made clear no amount of manipulation or emotional performance would change the outcome of this conversation. Sophia looked to me as if hoping I might intervene or moderate Daniel's response, but I simply stared at her with expression that conveyed absolute contempt and zero sympathy for whatever discomfort she was experiencing. She retreated into the guest room and began throwing her belongings into the overnight bag she had brought, her movements angry and jerky in ways that suggested she was transitioning from manipulative vulnerability to rage at not being able to control the situation toward her preferred outcome. Within 5 minutes she emerged with her bag, no longer crying. Her face set an expression of cold resentment that revealed her true character more honestly than any of the warmth and affection she had performed throughout our acquaintance. She walked past Daniel and me without speaking, descended the stairs with angry footsteps, and left through the front door without looking back or offering any final attempt at explanation or apology. After the door closed behind her, Daniel stood frozen in the hallway for a long moment before his legs seemed to give out and he sat down heavily on the floor with his back against the wall. I sat beside him and he leaned his head against my shoulder while beginning to cry with the kind of deep sobs that come from grief too overwhelming to contain any longer. I held him while he cried, stroking his hair the way I had done when he was a child experiencing pain I could not prevent or fix, providing the only comfort available when words were inadequate to address the scope of loss and betrayal he was processing. We sat together on the hallway floor for perhaps 20 minutes before Daniel's crying gradually subsided into exhausted silence. He lifted his head from my shoulder and asked what he was supposed to do now, how he was supposed to proceed with his life when everything he had believed about his future had just been revealed as illusion built on lies and betrayal. I told him that he would grieve and be angry and feel all the difficult emotions that naturally arose from experiencing this kind of harm, but that he would also eventually recognize that discovering the truth now rather than after marriage was a form of protection even though it felt like pure devastation in the immediate moment. I explained that people who are capable of this level of betrayal do not suddenly develop integrity after marriage, that Sophia would have eventually destroyed him far more completely if he had built his life around partnership with someone so fundamentally untrustworthy. I told him that his father's betrayal was separate but equally significant, that Robert had demonstrated character defects that required Daniel to fundamentally reassess their relationship and determine what boundaries and distance would be necessary to protect himself going forward. I acknowledged that none of these recognitions made the current pain less intense, but that understanding the strategic value of early discovery might help him contextualize the experience as something survivable rather than permanently destroying. Daniel asked whether I thought he would ever be able to trust anyone again after experiencing betrayal by both his fiancée and his father within the same relationship. I told him honestly that rebuilding trust after profound betrayal required time and conscious effort, but was absolutely possible, that not everyone operated with the same moral bankruptcy that Sophia and Robert had demonstrated, and that learning to identify red flags and trust his instincts would make him more rather than less capable of building healthy relationships in the future. I explained that people who have experienced betrayal and chosen to process that experience strategically rather than allowing it to make them permanently cynical often emerge with greater wisdom and stronger boundaries that actually improve their relationship outcomes. We eventually stood from the hallway floor and Daniel asked whether Robert knew yet that he had been exposed, whether my husband was aware that his affair had been revealed and his relationship with his son had been destroyed. I told Daniel that Robert was likely asleep in our bedroom, unaware that the comfortable avoidance that had characterized the past 2 days had just ended and consequences were beginning to materialize. Daniel said he wanted to confront his father immediately, that Robert needed to face accountability for what he had done rather than being allowed to sleep peacefully, while Daniel processed devastation that Robert had caused. I suggested that confrontation might be more effective in the morning when everyone had rested, and when the conversation could occur with more composure and strategic thinking rather than purely emotional reaction. But Daniel was adamant that he could not wait, that his father would face him tonight and would experience at least some immediate consequence for the betrayal he had perpetrated. I recognized that Daniel needed this confrontation for his own processing and healing, that sometimes immediate action was necessary even when strategic delay might seem preferable from purely tactical perspective. Together we walked to the master bedroom where Robert was indeed sleeping, apparently undisturbed by Sophia's departure or the conversations that had been occurring elsewhere in the house. Daniel turned on the overhead light with deliberate force and called his father's name with voice loud enough to wake him abruptly from whatever peaceful dreams he had been enjoying. Robert sat up in bed with confusion that rapidly transformed to alarm as he registered both Daniel's presence and the expression on his son's face that made clear this was not a casual middle-of-the-night visit. Before Robert could speak or ask questions, Daniel told him with cold precision that he knew everything about the affair with Sophia, that the relationship was over, and that Robert had destroyed any possibility of continuing relationship with his son through choices that demonstrated complete absence of paternal love or basic human decency. The words landed like physical blows and I watched Robert's face cycle through shock, guilt, and then calculation as he apparently tried to determine what response might minimize damage or create opportunity for manipulation toward better outcome than the total rejection Daniel was communicating. Robert began to speak and Daniel cut him off, stating that nothing Robert said would change the fundamental reality that he had betrayed his son in the most intimate way possible, that words were meaningless from someone who had proven himself willing to lie and manipulate without apparent conscience or concern for the harm he inflicted. Daniel told his father that he would be moving his belongings out of our family home within the next week, that he wanted no contact or communication from Robert, and that as far as Daniel was concerned he no longer had a father because the man he had believed was his father had been revealed as stranger wearing familiar face. Robert attempted to stand from the bed, his movements suggesting he intended to approach Daniel with some combination of explanation and physical gesture that might soften the absolute rejection his son had just delivered. Daniel stepped backward with expression making clear that he would not tolerate any attempt at physical contact or false intimacy, his body language communicating that the parental relationship that had existed between them for 26 years had been terminated by Robert's choices, and could not be restored through gestures or words. Robert froze in his half-standing position, apparently recognizing that any further movement toward Daniel would be met with escalation rather than reconciliation, and he slowly sat back down on the edge of the bed with defeated posture that suggested the full scope of consequences was beginning to register in ways he had not anticipated during the comfortable avoidance of the past 2 days. Robert turned his attention to me, standing silently near the doorway observing the confrontation between father and son, and he asked in voice carrying desperation whether we could speak privately before any permanent decisions were made about our marriage or our family. I told him with calm that felt almost inhuman that there was nothing he could say that would change fundamental realities about who he was and what he had done, that our marriage had ended the moment I walked into my office on Thursday and discovered him with Sophia, and that the only conversations remaining between us would be conducted through attorneys managing the dissolution of legal and financial ties that had once represented genuine partnership but now signified only shared history, requiring methodical dismantling. The finality in my tone seemed to penetrate Robert's apparent belief that he might still be able to manage this situation toward some outcome less catastrophic than total loss of both his marriage and his relationship with his son. His face collapsed into expression of genuine distress that might have moved me to sympathy if I had not spent the past 2 days watching him perform normalcy while knowing he had systematically betrayed everyone who trusted him. He began speaking rapidly about how the situation was more complicated than it appeared, how his relationship with Sophia had developed in ways he had not intended or fully controlled, how he had been planning to end things with her but had not found the right moment to have that conversation without causing exactly the kind of family crisis we were now experiencing. Daniel interrupted his father's explanation with harsh laugh that contained no humor, only bitter recognition of manipulation tactics being deployed even in this moment of exposure and accountability. He told Robert that attempting to portray himself as victim of circumstances beyond his control was pathetic and insulting, that every choice to meet Sophia privately, every email and text message exchanged over months of affair, every moment of physical intimacy they had shared represented deliberate decision made with full knowledge that discovery would destroy his son and his marriage. Daniel said that Robert apparently believed everyone around him was too stupid or too trusting to recognize manipulation when it was being directed at them, but that the evidence of sustained betrayal over months eliminated any possibility of characterizing the affair as moment of weakness or unintended consequence of complicated feelings. Robert's expression shifted from desperate explanation toward something approaching anger, as he apparently recognized that his usual strategies for managing difficult conversations were not producing their intended effects. He told Daniel that he did not understand the complexities of adult relationships and long-term marriage, that sometimes people develop connections with others that filled needs not being met in their primary relationships, and that judging situations from outside without full context was easier than actually navigating the complicated emotional realities involved. The statement revealed either complete lack of self-awareness about how inappropriate it was to make these arguments to the son he had betrayed, or such profound narcissism that he genuinely believed his needs and feelings justified any behavior regardless of harm to others. I spoke for the first time since entering the bedroom, my voice cutting through Robert's self-justifying narrative with tone that made clear I would not tolerate any further attempts to reframe his betrayal as understandable response to unmet needs or complicated circumstances. I told him that his characterization of our marriage as lacking in ways that drove him toward Sophia was revisionist fiction designed to excuse inexcusable behavior, that our relationship had been strong and functional until he chose to pursue affair that had nothing to do with any legitimate deficiencies in what I provided as partner, and everything to do with his own character flaws, and his apparent inability to maintain integrity when confronted with temptation. I explained that I had documentation of his communications with Sophia beginning many months before he could plausibly claim any significant problems in our marriage, that the timeline made clear he had pursued this relationship opportunistically rather than as response to genuine crisis or unmet needs. I told him that his attempt to blame me implicitly for driving him toward affair was classic manipulation tactic, used by unfaithful partners to avoid taking full responsibility for choices they made independently and deliberately. I said that I was no longer interested in his explanations or his justifications, that my only remaining interactions with him would be conducted through legal proceedings that would divide our assets and formalize the end of marriage that he had already destroyed through his actions. Robert's face showed shock at the directness and finality of my statement, suggesting that despite everything that had occurred over the past 2 days, he had somehow maintained belief that I might eventually be persuaded toward reconciliation, or at least toward less absolute rejection of continued relationship. He asked whether I was really prepared to throw away 28 years of marriage over what he characterized as mistake that could be corrected, if we were willing to work on our relationship with appropriate support and guidance. The question demonstrated either stunning lack of understanding about the severity of what he had done or deliberate minimization designed to make me doubt my own assessment of the situation. I told Robert that I was not throwing away our marriage because our marriage no longer existed, that he had destroyed it systematically over months of deliberate betrayal, while I remained ignorantly committed to partnership I believed we shared. I explained that counseling and reconciliation work were appropriate responses to relationship difficulties between partners operating in good faith who had temporarily lost their way, but were completely inappropriate responses to sustained deception by someone who had demonstrated fundamental absence of integrity and respect for their partner. I said that I had no interest in working on relationship with person who had proven himself willing to betray me in most intimate way possible while maintaining performance of devoted husband, that trust once broken so thoroughly could not be rebuilt regardless of how much therapeutic intervention might be applied. Daniel had been listening to this exchange with expression that suggested he was processing new information about the dynamics that had apparently characterized his parents' marriage beneath the surface presentation he had observed throughout his childhood and young adulthood. He asked me directly whether I had suspected anything before Thursday's discovery, whether there had been warning signs I had noticed but dismissed or rationalized. I told him honestly that I had observed changes in Robert's behavior over recent months, but had attributed them to work stress and normal relationship evolution rather than recognizing them as indicators of affair, that I had trusted his explanations and his characterizations of his activities, because I had believed we had relationship built on fundamental honesty, even when we disagreed or struggled with specific issues. I explained to Daniel that one of the most painful aspects of this betrayal was recognizing how thoroughly I had participated in my own deception by choosing to accept explanations that were superficially plausible, rather than investigating more deeply when my instincts suggested something was wrong. I told him that learning to trust those instincts and to investigate rather than rationalize when patterns seemed concerning was one of the most important lessons I was taking from this experience, that protecting oneself sometimes required being willing to risk discomfort of confrontation rather than prioritizing harmony and trust that might be misplaced. Robert interrupted to say that my characterization of our relationship history was unfair and one-sided, that there had been genuine problems and disconnection between us that I was now refusing to acknowledge because doing so would complicate the victim narrative I was constructing. Daniel turned on his father with fury that had been building throughout the conversation and told him to stop talking, that every word from his mouth made the situation worse and revealed more clearly the depth of his moral bankruptcy and his inability to take genuine responsibility for the harm he had caused. Daniel said that whether or not there had been problems in his parents' marriage was completely irrelevant to the question of whether Robert's affair with his son's fiancée was defensible or understandable, that those were separate issues and conflating them was manipulative attempt to shift blame and avoid accountability. The clarity and strength in Daniel's response, his ability to maintain moral reasoning and reject manipulation despite the emotional trauma he was experiencing, made me feel profound pride mixed with the grief of watching him have to develop these capabilities under such painful circumstances. He was demonstrating resilience and strategic thinking that would serve him well throughout his life, but I would have given anything to spare him from needing to deploy those capabilities against his own father in defense of basic standards of decency and respect. Robert seemed to deflate visibly as he recognized that neither his son nor his wife was going to be persuaded toward any outcome less absolute than complete rejection and separation. He asked in voice that sounded genuinely broken what he was supposed to do now, where he was supposed to go, how he was supposed to proceed with his life when everything he cared about was being taken away simultaneously. The self-pity in the question was almost impressive in its obliviousness to the fact that he had created these consequences through his own choices, and that the people he was losing had far more legitimate claim to devastation and grief than he did. I told Robert that his living arrangements and his emotional processing were his problems to solve, that I was not his caretaker or his therapist and had no obligation to help him manage consequences of his own actions. I explained that he would need to find somewhere else to stay beginning immediately, that I wanted him out of the house before morning so that Daniel and I could begin processing what had occurred without his presence creating additional stress and discomfort. I said that he could return later in the week with notice to collect clothing and personal items, but that the house itself was mine based on ownership documentation my attorney had already reviewed, and that he had no legal right to remain in residence against my wishes. Robert began to protest that he had nowhere to go in the middle of the night, that making him leave immediately was unreasonable and vindictive rather than necessary for any legitimate purpose. Daniel told his father that he could stay with Sophia since they had been so committed to their relationship that they were willing to destroy their connections to everyone else, his voice dripping with sarcasm that made clear exactly how little sympathy he felt for Robert's current predicament. Robert said that his relationship with Sophia was over, that she had been a mistake he deeply regretted, that he had no intention of continuing any contact with her after what had been revealed. The statement was presumably intended to demonstrate Robert's recognition of his errors and his commitment to repairing the damage he had caused, but it had exactly the opposite effect on both Daniel and me. If Robert had genuinely cared about Sophia and believed their relationship was meaningful enough to justify the betrayal of his family, his behavior would have been wrong but at least comprehensible as misguided pursuit of authentic connection. The fact that he was now characterizing her as mistake he regretted suggested that the affair had been purely about ego gratification or entertainment without even the excuse of genuine emotional attachment, making his choices seem even more cruel and pointless than they had appeared when I imagined he might have developed real feelings that clouded his judgment. I told Robert that I did not care about his current feelings toward Sophia or his regrets about choices he had made, that his internal emotional state was irrelevant to the practical reality that he needed to leave my house immediately and figure out his own living arrangements without any assistance or emotional support from the family he had betrayed. I said that he could call a hotel or reach out to friends or colleagues who might be willing to accommodate him temporarily, but that extending his presence in my home beyond the next 30 minutes was not an option I was willing to consider regardless of how inconvenient or uncomfortable his alternatives might be. Robert stood from the bed with defeated movements and began gathering clothing from the closet we had shared for years, his actions mechanical and his expression suggesting he was still struggling to fully process that this was actually happening rather than nightmare he would wake from or situation he could somehow talk his way out of with appropriate explanations and apologies. I watched him pack a suitcase with essentials needed for several days away from home, and felt absolutely nothing except cold satisfaction that consequences were finally materializing for behavior that deserved significant penalties. Daniel remained in the doorway throughout Robert's packing process, his presence serving as physical reminder that he was witnessing his father's departure, and that reconciliation would not be possible through future manipulation or emotional appeals. When Robert finished packing and moved toward the door with his suitcase, he paused near Daniel and attempted to make eye contact while saying that he loved his son, and hoped that eventually they might be able to repair their relationship, even if that process took considerable time and effort. Daniel looked at his father with expression of complete indifference and told him that the person he had loved as his father no longer existed if that person had ever actually existed at all, that the man standing in front of him was a stranger who happened to share biological connection, but had forfeited any claim to parental relationship through choices that revealed fundamental absence of love and respect. Robert flinched visibly at the finality in Daniel's voice and the absolute rejection being communicated, but he apparently recognized that further attempts at engagement would only make the situation worse. He walked past his son without additional comment and descended the stairs toward the front door while Daniel and I followed at distance that made clear we were ensuring his departure rather than accompanying him with any supportive intent. At the door, Robert turned back one final time and opened his mouth as if preparing to make some final statement or appeal, But I simply stared at him with expression that communicated that anything he said would be wasted breath and unwelcome intrusion. He closed his mouth, picked up his suitcase, and walked out into the night toward his car parked in the driveway. After the door closed behind Robert, Daniel and I stood together in the quiet house that suddenly felt entirely different despite looking exactly the same as it had hours earlier when 40 guests had filled these rooms celebrating what they believed was joyous family milestone. The silence was heavy but not oppressive, carrying quality of relief mixed with exhaustion, rather than purely negative emotional weight. Daniel turned to me and said that he could not believe everything that had happened in the past 3 hours, that he felt like he had aged years in the span of single evening as his entire understanding of his family and his relationships had been fundamentally restructured. I told him that trauma and betrayal did create accelerated growth and maturation when processed actively rather than avoided or denied, that the person he was becoming through this experience would be stronger and wiser, even though the process of getting there was extraordinarily painful. I explained that he would need time to grieve multiple losses simultaneously, the end of his engagement and the destruction of his relationship with his father, and the death of his assumptions about how people he loved would treat him and each other. I said that all of those grief processes were legitimate and necessary, but that he should also recognize that discovering truth about Sophia and Robert now rather than years into marriage or after even deeper investment was form of protection even though it felt like pure devastation in the immediate moment. Daniel asked whether I really believed we would be okay eventually, whether life could actually return to some form of normalcy after everything had been so thoroughly disrupted. I told him honestly that we would not return to our previous normal because that normal had been built partially on illusions that had now been shattered, but that we would build new normal based on clearer understanding of reality and stronger boundaries around what we would accept in relationships going forward. I explained that people who survived betrayal and chose to process the experience strategically rather than allowing it to destroy them often emerged with capabilities and wisdom they had not possessed before, that adversity could be transformative in positive ways, even though no one would choose to experience it voluntarily. We went to the kitchen and I made tea while Daniel sat at the table processing everything that had occurred, his expression cycling through various emotions as different aspects of the evening's revelations surfaced in his consciousness. He asked about my plans for divorce proceedings, and whether I had already consulted with attorney as I had mentioned during our earlier conversation. I explained that I had spoken with Patricia Wolf on Thursday evening immediately after discovering Robert and Sophia, that we had scheduled formal meeting for Monday morning to begin filing paperwork and developing comprehensive legal strategy that would protect my interests and ensure fair division of assets based on actual contributions to our marital estate rather than Robert's preferred characterization of who deserved what. Daniel said he wanted to be involved in supporting me through the divorce process, that he recognized I had been protecting him by delaying revelation until after the party but that going forward he wanted to be active participant in family decisions rather than someone shielded from difficult realities. I told him that I appreciated his support and would welcome his involvement in ways that felt appropriate, but that I also wanted him to focus on his own healing and rebuilding, rather than feeling responsible for managing my emotional state or my practical needs. I explained that part of what I was learning through this experience was that I had spent too many years prioritizing other people's needs and emotions over my own well-being, and that moving forward I intended to establish clearer boundaries around self-care and appropriate distribution of emotional labor in relationships. We talked for another hour about practical questions regarding how to inform extended family members about what had occurred, how to handle social situations where people would inevitably ask questions about the canceled engagement and the dissolved marriage, and how to manage the complicated emotions that would arise as we processed betrayal by people we had loved and trusted completely. Daniel asked whether I thought Robert had been having other affairs throughout our marriage, or whether Sophia represented first time he had betrayed our vows. I told him honestly that I did not know and that in some ways the answer to that question was less important than the recognition that he had proven himself capable of sustained deception, which suggested that whatever specific history might exist, his character was fundamentally not what I had believed it to be. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside our kitchen windows, Daniel and I finally acknowledged that we were both exhausted beyond our ability to continue productive conversation. We agreed to try to get a few hours of sleep before beginning the practical work of informing family members and managing the immediate aftermath of the evening's confrontations. Daniel hugged me before heading upstairs to his room, And he told me that despite everything that had happened, he felt grateful that I had been strong enough to tell him the truth and strategic enough to document evidence that prevented Robert and Sophia from manipulating the narrative or minimizing their betrayal. He said that watching me maintain composure and take effective action in response to devastating circumstances had taught him more about resilience and integrity than any abstract lesson could have conveyed, and that he would carry those lessons forward as he rebuilt his life and his understanding of what healthy relationships required. I woke after less than 3 hours of fitful sleep to find sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows with the kind of aggressive brightness that seemed to mock the gravity of everything that had transpired during the night. My body ached from accumulated tension and insufficient rest, muscles protesting as I forced myself out of bed and toward the bathroom, where I stood under hot water that did nothing to wash away the exhaustion that went far deeper than physical fatigue. The face that looked back at me from the mirror showed evidence of the strain I had been carrying, dark circles under my eyes and new lines around my mouth that seemed to have appeared overnight, as if my body was registering the trauma visibly even as I worked to maintain internal composure. The house was quiet as I moved downstairs to make coffee, the silence carrying entirely different quality than the peaceful morning stillness I had experienced thousands of times throughout nearly 3 decades of marriage in this space. This was the silence of absence and ending rather than restful pause, the house itself seeming to recognize that fundamental changes had occurred within its walls, and that the family structure that had organized life here for 26 years had been irrevocably altered. I walked through rooms that still showed evidence of Saturday's party, champagne flutes and dessert plates that had not been cleared during the chaos of late-night confrontations, the physical remnants of celebration that had been revealed as complete farce within hours of its conclusion. I began the cleanup work mechanically, finding strange comfort in the concrete tasks that required no emotional processing or strategic decision-making. Washing dishes and folding table linens provided temporary refuge from the complicated work that awaited me once I moved beyond immediate domestic maintenance into the realm of informing family members and managing the social consequences of Robert's departure and Daniel's broken engagement. Each plate I washed represented a guest who had attended the party with no knowledge of the betrayal being conducted by 2 of the people they had come to celebrate, and I wondered how many of them would feel deceived or manipulated when they learned that the happy occasion had been built on lies that were exposed within hours of their departure. Daniel appeared in the kitchen around 9 o'clock, his appearance suggesting he had slept no better than I had despite his exhaustion. He poured coffee and sat at the table watching me continue the cleanup work before offering to help with the remaining tasks. We worked together in companionable silence for perhaps 20 minutes, finding some measure of peace in the shared domestic labor that required no conversation or emotional processing. When the kitchen was finally restored to its normal state with all evidence of the party removed and stored or discarded, we sat together at the table that had been the site of so many family meals and significant conversations throughout Daniel's childhood. Daniel asked how I was feeling and whether I had slept at all after we had finally gone to bed just a few hours earlier. I told him honestly that I was exhausted and emotionally raw, but also experiencing strange sense of clarity and purpose, that having moved through the immediate crisis of revelation and confrontation, I now felt ready to begin the practical work of rebuilding my life according to my own preferences and values rather than continuing to accommodate partnership that had been revealed as fundamentally corrupted. I explained that while I grieved the loss of what I had believed my marriage to be, I did not actually grieve the loss of relationship with Robert as he had revealed himself to be, that discovering his true character was painful but also liberating in ways I was only beginning to fully appreciate. My son looked at me with expression combining admiration and concern, and he asked whether I had anyone I could talk to about what I was experiencing beyond just our conversations and the strategic planning with my attorney. The question revealed maturity and emotional intelligence that made me feel both proud of the person he had become and sad that he was having to demonstrate these capabilities under such difficult circumstances. I told him that I planned to reach out to my sister Margaret, who had been watching me with obvious concern during the party, and would need to be informed about what had occurred before she heard rumors or partial information through other family channels. I explained that Margaret would be furious on my behalf and completely supportive of whatever decisions I made about how to proceed, that having her as ally and confidant would provide emotional support that would be critical during the difficult weeks and months ahead as I navigated divorce proceedings and the social consequences of ending a marriage that most people in our extended family and social circle had viewed as stable and successful. Daniel said he was relieved that I would have that support, and he volunteered to be present when I told Margaret if I thought that would be helpful rather than making me manage that conversation alone. Before I could respond to his offer, my phone began ringing with call from Margaret herself, her timing suggesting that her instincts about something being seriously wrong had prompted her to reach out first thing Sunday morning rather than waiting for me to contact her. I answered and heard immediate concern in her voice as she asked whether I was all right, and what had been happening the previous evening that had made me seem so strained despite the apparently successful party. I told her that I needed to talk to her in person about something significant, and asked whether she could come to my house that morning, rather than discussing the situation over the phone. Margaret agreed immediately and said she would be there within 30 minutes. Her voice carrying edge of alarm that suggested she recognized the seriousness of whatever I needed to discuss even without knowing specific details. After we ended the call, I told Daniel that his presence during the conversation with Margaret would actually be helpful, that having him there would demonstrate that we were unified in our response to what had occurred, and would allow Margaret to understand the full scope of the situation, including the impact on Daniel and his broken engagement. Daniel agreed, and we spent the time before Margaret's arrival discussing how much detail to share with her initially, and how to frame the narrative in ways that were honest without being overwhelming or requiring extended explanation of every element of Robert's betrayal. Margaret arrived exactly 28 minutes after our phone conversation, her speed suggesting she had left her house immediately after hanging up without stopping for the usual preparations that typically preceded social visits. She embraced me as soon as I opened the door, holding on longer than normal greeting would warrant, and asking again whether I was all right and what had happened that required this kind of urgent private conversation. I directed her to the living room where Daniel was waiting, and her expression shifted to deeper concern as she registered his presence and the obvious strain visible in both our faces. I began the explanation with the core facts presented as directly as possible to avoid extended lead-up that would only increase Margaret's anxiety. I told her that I had discovered Robert having an affair with Sophia on Thursday afternoon, that I had maintained composure through Saturday's party while gathering evidence and planning how to handle the revelation, and that Daniel and I had confronted them late Saturday night after the guests departed. I explained that both relationships had ended immediately, that Robert had left the house and would not be returning, and that I had already consulted with a divorce attorney and would be filing papers early in the coming week. Margaret's face cycled through shock, disbelief, fury, and protective determination as she processed the information I was delivering with clinical precision. She interrupted several times with questions seeking clarification about specific details, her legal training as a contracts attorney apparently making her approach the situation with some of the same systematic analysis I had employed in my own response. She asked whether I had documentation of the affair that would support my position in divorce proceedings, whether I had secured access to financial accounts and records that might become disputed during asset division, and whether I had informed any other family members about what had occurred before telling her. I answered each question with the same direct efficiency she was employing, explaining the evidence I had gathered and the strategic planning I had undertaken with Patricia's guidance. Margaret's expression showed approval mixed with her anger about the situation itself, and she said that she was both devastated by what I had experienced and impressed by how effectively I had responded despite the emotional trauma involved. She turned to Daniel and asked how he was managing the dual betrayal by his fiancé and his father, her voice gentling with the kind of maternal concern that had always characterized her relationship with her nephew despite her typically direct and unsentimental communication style. Daniel explained his own discovery process and the confrontations that had occurred after I had shown him the evidence I had compiled, his voice remaining remarkably steady as he recounted details that were clearly still extremely painful to discuss. He told Margaret that while he was devastated by Sophia's betrayal, he was even more disturbed by his father's willingness to pursue relationship with his son's fiancée in violation of every principle of parental love and basic decency. He said that he had spent much of the sleepless night trying to reconcile the father he thought he knew with the person who had been revealed through this betrayal, and that he was still struggling to understand how someone could maintain such completely contradictory versions of themselves simultaneously. Margaret listened to Daniel's account with increasing anger visible in her expression, and when he finished she turned back to me and asked what Robert had said when confronted about his behavior, and whether he had offered any explanation or apology that demonstrated genuine understanding of the harm he had caused. I told her that Robert had attempted various manipulation tactics, including minimizing the affair as mistake he regretted, implying that problems in our marriage had driven him toward Sophia, and expressing self-pity about the consequences he was experiencing as a result of his choices being exposed. I explained that none of his responses had demonstrated authentic remorse or accountability, that his primary concern seemed to be managing the situation to minimize his losses, rather than genuinely grappling with the moral implications of what he had done. My sister made a sound of disgust and said that Robert's response was completely consistent with narcissistic personality patterns she had observed in him throughout the years but had attributed to garden-variety male entitlement rather than recognizing as indicators of more serious character pathology. She said that in retrospect there had been numerous instances over the decades where Robert had demonstrated concerning lack of empathy and excessive focus on his own needs and perceptions, but that these patterns had been subtle enough or explained away sufficiently that she had not recognized them as warning signs of someone capable of the kind of betrayal he had perpetrated. Margaret's observation opened conversation about whether there had been signs of Robert's character defects that I had missed or rationalized throughout our marriage, whether the person he had revealed himself to be during this crisis had always existed beneath the surface performance or whether something had changed in him in recent years that had made this behavior possible. I told Margaret honestly that I had been asking myself the same questions repeatedly since Thursday's discovery, that I was struggling to determine whether I had been systematically deceived by a skilled manipulator throughout our entire relationship, or whether I had participated in my own deception by choosing to accept his explanations and characterizations rather than investigating more deeply when my instincts suggested something was wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.